right, you guys have asked for it. This episode is all about insulin resistance and, more importantly, what we can do about it. And the good news is we can really do wonders with lifestyle and nutrition here. So in this episode, we're really going to explain what exactly is insulin resistance. We're going to talk about how to detect this earlier than most people sort of discover it later on when their glucose is elevated and maybe they're, pre-diabetic at that point. This shows up a lot earlier. So we're going to talk about that. And then we're really going to spend a lot of time in this episode talking in detail how to structure your meals, how to put together your daily routine in terms of eating, and exercise as well really plays a role here. And we're going to, have you leaving this episode knowing exactly what to do about insulin resistance. So let's first talk about what is this insulin resistance?
Yes, absolutely. So this gets a little bit confusing because a lot of people don't realize the difference between glucose or sugar and insulin.
Yes.
So those are different, right? Insulin is actually released from the pancreas. It's a hormone, and it tells the cells to take sugar or glucose up from the blood. So when we have something like diabetes or high sugar, it's because that sugar is in the bloodstream, right? But insulin tells our cells, hey, there's sugar in the blood, like you got to take that, right? Because we don't want sugar in the blood. Right. That will lead us to diabetes. So insulin is a hormone and it acts as like a lock and key, right? It's like, that signal to the cells, take up this sugar. So over time, if we consume a lot of glucose or sugar in excess, eventually our cells don't quite respond to that insulin hormone signaling like they should. Mm-hmm. So then our pancreas says, okay, let me release a little bit more insulin because the blood sugar is still high. Like, hello, come on cells, let's go. So it's like our pancreas kind of yelling at our cells, like, where are you guys?
Yeah.
And so it keeps releasing insulin more and more. And eventually our cells just, they don't respond to that insulin. So that's what leads to insulin resistance over time. And those insulin levels really start to build up.
Yeah.
Now, insulin resistance, I tell my patients, is like the pre-diabetes. So because a lot of times, again, patients will, and I feel so bad for them because they'll go to their primary care doctors and they'll say, hey, your blood sugar is high. You've got pre-diabetes or diabetes. And patients are like, what the heck? I never had that before. Where did it come from? Mm-hmm. And likely they had insulin resistance probably for many years.
Right.
And no one told them because nobody checked an insulin score. So we'll
Right.
talk about labs
Yep.
in a minute here, but that's what insulin resistance is. And it has a lot of downstream effects, right? Mm-hmm. Chronic diseases, diabetes.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think exactly, like that's a great description of it. These sluggish receptors mm-hmm. leading to elevated levels of insulin in the bloodstream. And really what, plays a big role in this, because people start to go like, well, how did I get this? Like, what is going on here? And one of the biggest drivers of that then is that visceral fat, this fat, mm-hmm. visceral yep. adipose tissue. And that fat is one of the strongest drivers of insulin resistance. So yep. that's the fat that kind of sits around, like we do have, there's a purpose to it, some like small amount of it.
Yes.
Where it cushions the organs yep. and it sits, in the abdominal cavity. But as you have a caloric excess mm-hmm. and you start gaining fat in your midsection, then this becomes this whole like metabolic driver of inflammation and insulin resistance.
Yep.
So it, a lot of times, you could reflect back and go, okay, well, there were dietary triggers here. Now, right. interestingly, sometimes you'll see these patients that come in and we're very routinely screening them for insulin resistance yes. and they're thin. Right?
Yes.
And so
yep.
you might not visibly see it, but it could be this situation where people are like what we call, it could be called skinny fat,
yes,
right? And
exactly.
you do a body composition analysis mm-hmm. and you can see some fat there.
Yeah.
Occasionally though, I have run into it where it's kind of confusing, where
yeah.
it's like, okay, they don't have a lot of visceral fat here
right.
and they're still insulin resistant.
Yes. And in that case, what I notice is it's usually because of low muscle mass, mm-hmm. right? Because our muscles are reservoirs for sugar and glucose, right?
Yes,
And
yeah.
because they're metabolically really active. And so it's a lot of like my teeny tiny older women, you know, who come in and they have a great diet, right? But they just have no muscle mass on them. So
Yes.
that's why also in social media right now, everyone's like, lift weights, you know,
Right.
you got to put on some muscle
Right.
mass.
And
So
there's some truth to that.
there
right?
is, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. So yeah, and then, you know, that visceral fat, right? So what happens is it builds up and those cells actually release a lot of signals that interfere with insulin signaling and then cause inflammation. Like we've had a lot of episodes on inflammation recently. High visceral fat is a huge driver of metabolic inflammation. So again, inflammation is not the root cause.
Right.
It's the visceral fat coming from lifestyle. Like that's
Yes.
the root cause right there.
Yeah.
So an important distinction.
Yeah, absolutely. So you got a couple of things going on here, you know, and usually this is driven over time
Yes.
by eating too much in the way of like
Right.
total calories, first of all, but a lot of times a lot of those calories coming from high levels of, you know, processed starch,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And the body just cannot keep up with that load,
Right.
you know, for extended periods of time.
Yep, you got it. Okay, should we talk about some labs maybe? So, you know, like you said, it's not always, we can't always look at somebody and say, oh yeah, you have high visceral fat, right? So yes, body composition testing, super helpful. When it comes to insulin resistance, we can absolutely measure just a fasting raw insulin score. That's super helpful.
Yep.
Additionally, we've got some fancier tests now that have some algorithms involved with something called C-peptide, which is a little bit confusing, and that's part of the insulin molecule as well. But those can be a little bit even more specific to give you kind of this insulin resistance score.
Right.
But then something really basic that most people can get easily from their primary care doctor are your triglyceride levels. And not always, but often those are going to correlate with your insulin. So higher triglyceride levels, we usually see higher insulin scores as well.
So it's kind of like an indicator where that's part of the annual screening. Like if you're getting your annual physical, you will never have insulin on there in your annual physical unless you ask for it or that doctor is like trained in a way that they're really looking at that in detail.
Right.
But a standard lipid panel will be on there. And so if you're seeing, you know, a borderline elevated triglyceride or even it's, you know, very highly elevated, that's concerning. And then even in some of these patients, a low HDL, that's another kind of like clue in that could be going on. But then you could follow up and say like, yes, like, can I get an insulin test? It needs to be fasting. And then, that insulin resistance score, we're using maybe more now because I think it can probably pick up some more cases that you might be missing on just a fasting insulin, right?
Yeah, and I do see that a lot, right? Where somebody might have an insulin score of a 7 or 8, which is a little bit higher than what we want, but not too bad. But then that C-peptide level that I mentioned is elevated, and that really pushes them into the insulin resistance
because it means that they're really pumping out a lot of insulin, right? That's what that C-peptide is telling us. So that's really good. Another thing I would note here, and I know we want to spend lots of time talking about diet, but another thing I would note is that on a standard lab, like, you know, our, you know, diagnostic labs that we use that would be covered by insurance, the reference range is not ideal, right? So when we're looking at it, the reference range we see printed on our lab is less than or greater than 17 would be considered elevated. And that's going to be way too high. Like we would say optimal ideal is under 5, you know, some people say 6 or 7, but like in that range and below. So if you're getting an insulin test and it comes up as 12, it's going to not be flagged. Just look normal. And that is not normal.
Too high.
Yeah. So that's going to be diagnostic of insulin resistance.
Yeah. All right, diet time.
Yeah.
Here we go.
How exciting.
So
everyone asks for this.
Exactly. So when Jen and I were planning this episode, we really sat down and said, what are our beliefs? Like, what are we teaching our patients? Because there are so many mixed messages when it comes to nutrition and insulin resistance. So The first thing is, and this is a little bit more basic, this concept of glycemic index and glycemic load, it's been around for a long time. Like, it is pretty foundational, but it is something that I think is really easy for people to understand, and it works, and it's legitimate, and it's evidence-based, and it's something that I continuously come back to. So essentially we have these, two terms, glycemic index and glycemic load. And the goal of these is to use them to categorize foods to help people understand how those foods affect your blood sugar.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
So higher numbers of those indexes means that these foods are going to have a more negative impact on your blood sugar, right?
Yep.
So glycemic index is how much does that food raise your blood sugar? Glycemic load takes it a step further, and it brings into consideration the serving size of that
and that's
food.
Right, and that's key,
Yes,
right? That's
absolutely.
what we want to, if you're looking at charts. So you can go online, you can look this up.
There's
you
apps.
could get, apps. You could get AI to build you something now. There's lots of ways to do this, but you really want to make sure that you're coming at it from the glycemic load perspective, right?
Exactly.
And that's really going to consider the serving size. So then when we're doing nutritional counseling with a patient, we're not saying like, okay, you can eat sweet potatoes with this meal and not tell them how much, right?
Exactly.
That's a great example of where something could go to a high glycemic effect versus a moderate. So a sweet potato is not considered low glycemic at all, really. But you can have some of it. So this is where also you could get into situations where something looks like it's really high, but depending on the serving size, it might be okay for you to have, and also in combination.
Yes. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. So ideally here, with glycemic load, a low glycemic load is 10 or less. So we give foods numbers, and the lower the number, the lower the glycemic load, which means that you can essentially have more without it impacting your blood sugar as much.
Yeah.
So 1 to 10, and then 11 to 19, right? And then 20, I got to look at my chart here. 20 or more is considered high. So low, medium, and high.
Yeah.
And so that's the first step, right? And then the second step is, okay, what is the serving size of that food? So like you said, a sweet potato is going to have a higher glycemic load. But if you have a smaller amount, right, you're still okay. Because here's the thing is that when we eat in order to improve our blood sugar, right, it doesn't mean that we can also have less healthy foods. It gets a little confusing. So a sweet potato is healthy, right? Most people think oh yeah, sweet potato, that's healthy. So we don't want you to avoid sweet potatoes just because you think oh, they have a little bit of a higher glycemic load. So again, that's where that serving size comes into play here.
Yes.
And combining the food, that's a huge piece too.
Yeah.
So for example, we're not going to want to combine a sweet potato with a starchy vegetable that's also going to increase your glycemic load, because those are two things that are healthy, absolutely, but both having a more negative effect on the blood sugar.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's
so
a really good point. So this is where, so when we start thinking about serving sizes and, how much you can have on a plate, just like you mentioned, if we're talking about things that are in the low glycemic load category, then we're talking about, things like broccoli and spinach. And so
super low.
You can eat literally as much broccoli as you want, and you're not even going to go over.
Exactly.
Pretty much, right?
Exactly.
So no one can eat enough broccoli. That would make
it's true. I tell my
your
patients,
blood sugar.
It's so true. Yeah, I tell my patients I am never going to tell you to eat less greens, in most vegetables. Right? I give them a list of starchier vegetables that we do try to limit, but for the most part, I'm saying I'm never going to tell you to eat less vegetables.
Yeah. So those are basically unlimited, right? When we talk about non-starchy. Now this comes up is where. What do we consider starchy?
Right.
What are those vegetables that are starchy? And those are essentially the root vegetables, right? So we've got sweet potato, carrots, parsnip, turnip, beets, and then we get into just regular potatoes. Now, if you start looking at charts of potatoes, it matters the type of potato you
does.
eat. So this is where you want to really stick with more of like a smaller potato. So the baby potatoes are going to have a lower effect on the blood sugar. And then also the type, like those waxy potatoes. So a Yukon Gold or a red baby potato is going to be better for you, or the little fingerling type potatoes.
Yes.
But if you're talking about a russet potato, now you've got a very high glycemic food. Yeah. So even though if you kept the quantity the same as some baby Yukon Gold potatoes, it's going to have a completely different effect on your blood sugar.
Yep.
So basically the russet potatoes are out.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Except for Thanksgiving. Yeah, for insulin resistance. If that's not going to be a big, that's not going to be a regular thing in your diet, but sweet potato could be. Yep. And carrots can be, and things like beets can be. But your serving size is going to be small. So depending on your size and everything, we could be, and how severe the insulin resistance, we do want to take that into consideration too.
Absolutely.
And even what their diet is coming into it, right? So if someone is sitting down and they're eating loads and loads of processed carbs, when we start shifting them over, the change doesn't have to be as dramatic as for someone, unfortunately, for someone who's been eating relatively healthy. And now we've got to get pretty strict about serving sizes. So then we might be thinking more sort of like even a third of a cup of sweet potato, and then not having it on its own, and make sure we're combining it, just like you talked about, protein and fat. That's going to slow down that glycemic effect, right? As that gets into the bloodstream.
I want to give a couple more examples here of very low, medium and higher glycemic load, just so people have an understanding. So spinach, broccoli, avocado, those are all like 1 to 3, right, of glycemic load.
That's helpful.
A medium apple is a 6, a cup of blueberries, a 6, black beans, a half a cup cooked is about a 7, sweet potato, half a cup cooked is about an 11.
Right. So that's where you start going like, oh, that's why that sweet potato tastes so good, right? Like our brain knows where the sugar is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then higher is going to be white rice. A cup of that gives you a 23.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which again, like that 20 is going to be high glycemic load,
exactly.
right? So that's a full cup of white rice. That's going to be out for insulin resistance.
That is
that's
out.
Too much is going to really spike your blood sugar, and then your insulin receptors can't keep up with that.
Exactly. A bagel can be anywhere from like a low 20 to a 30, just depending on the type, the size, right? But that's spiking your blood sugar. And then, of course, like a sugary soda will be a 25.
Which that's always interesting, because people like routinely eat bagels and they're like, oh, it's a whole wheat bagel, it's fine. And it's very high glycemic effect when you learn that that's as high as drinking a soda.
Yeah.
It's pretty high effect on the blood sugar.
The other thing that people don't know is that oat milk has a very high glycemic load, very similar to soda.
Yeah.
So I take a lot of patients off oat milk, which, think about it. It tastes good. Like, it's creamier, it's sweeter. Like, yes, hello. Of course it's going to be a higher
But it's
glycemic load.
it's an extracted sort of syrup from a grain.
Carbs.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's not surprising if you start to think about it that way. Of like, oh, yeah, that could be a problem.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we've mentioned here combining foods. So let's dive into this a little bit more. I love the research on this because it is such a simple and effective way for people to really start managing blood sugar through nutrition. So like you said, right, when you combine a carbohydrate, no matter what the carbohydrate is, or starch or vegetable, right, something with a higher glycemic load, when you combine it with fat, fiber, and protein, it is not going to spike your blood sugar as much as it would on its own. So that cup of rice, right? 1 cup of white rice on its own, your blood sugar is going way up, right? No doubt. But if you were to combine it in some type of stir fry with some chicken, with some spinach, broccoli, right? And then a little bit of fat, maybe you put some avocado on top, not going to affect your blood sugar quite as much. If we take it a step further, this is for my really dedicated patients. I say you eat the chicken, the broccoli, and the avocado first.
Yes.
And then you have your rice. So we don't even mix it, right? We eat them separately. That's going to have an even more significant effect on your blood sugar. So really cool data. And this is real. Like this is legitimate. We have great data on this. Those healthy foods really attenuate that spike in blood sugar.
It's just so powerful and amazing to just think like, okay, you have your plate there. And even from the standpoint, you're out to dinner, right? And you're served a starch, a vegetable, and a protein. So you're sitting down, you've got like salmon and green beans and maybe some baby potatoes. Let's take that example. That can be like, that's a glycemically balanced meal. But you can even, and depending, you want to make sure that serving size of potatoes are going to be under, half a cup there. But you eat your salmon, maybe half of that, and start working on the green beans and get close to being done with your salmon before you start eating those potatoes. And you're setting yourself up for better insulin control, right? So that's how that could look on a plate. That's pretty fascinating that you could do that. And I think it's really empowering to know that, right? That, okay, I've got this and I start out here. What would be a problem is when they bring the bread to the table, and then you eat the bread first, you eat the corn chips first, like all of that is really the opposite of what you want to do.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So opposite of what we do here in America.
Yeah.
Okay, and then I really want to talk about, serving sizes in terms of what we are telling our patients. And we might differ slightly here, but I'll go first. And what I tell my patients is I say with breakfast, I really want you to start off with 50% protein and 50% a good carbohydrate. I don't like to use good and bad here, but like a complex, healthy carbohydrate, right? And, I like people to start off their day with carbs like earlier in the day versus later in the day. Because we need carbohydrates, right? Like we don't want people coming out of this episode and saying, oh my gosh, I can never eat a carbohydrate, right? That's not the goal.
Right.
Because they're healthy for our gut. We need the sugar.
Yeah.
But if we have carbohydrates earlier in the day, we're more active during the day, right? Whether we're at work, we're getting workouts in, we're chasing kids, whatever it is, right? Versus at night, we're kind of just hanging out watching Netflix, right? Well, I wish I was.
That would be nice.
That's what a lot of people are doing. So, we want to eat those carbohydrates at a time in the day when we're going to be more metabolically active. So,
and brain fuel too. That's another thing. And I notice this especially for women who are just like only eating protein at breakfast and they're fading by midday, right? They can't focus, can't get their work done. They're kind of scattered. If you shift some complex carbohydrate into that breakfast, they tend to notice the difference cognitively. So that's a really cool thing to notice.
Absolutely.
So what could a breakfast look like, right? So this is where everyone always goes like, okay, well, what should I be eating for breakfast now? I'm going to not eat my cereal or just like that bagel. A lot of people are just eating the half an English muffin and going out the door.
Exactly.
What would be a good example of breakfast?
So you really want to first focus on the protein, right? And so that could be a turkey or a chicken sausage, right? This could even be leftovers, chicken, steak, whatever you had for dinner. Eggs, of course, are a classic. I really like combining protein powder with oatmeal because that's your carbohydrate and your protein, right? Of course, you can do yogurt with fruit. Yogurt, your protein.
Like berries, rich in fiber. You still got your carbs in there as well.
Exactly. And we want to reiterate here, fruit absolutely counts as a carbohydrate. Breakfast is a great time to eat some fruit.
Yeah.
So then lunch, we really want to focus on veggies. I tell my patients half of that plate has got to be veggies, right? And then we bring in about a quarter protein and a quarter carbohydrates, right? And those might change slightly based on the patient. So then when I'm saying about a quarter carbohydrate, I'm talking about, anywhere from a quarter cup to a half a cup of that carbohydrate, whether it's beans, rice, quinoa, a small sweet potato, right? You could bring in fruit again. So small serving size compared to what we're used to for
of
carbohydrates.
Like a bed. So that's that concept of sort of having a bed of a starch, whether it's like rice or it's pasta or something like that. Really, we need to tighten that up and it's just taken up like a little spot on your plate. Right?
Exactly. And then for dinner, this will vary a little bit, right? If you have somebody who's really active, maybe they're getting their workout, a really hard workout in later in the day, I will give them a carbohydrate at dinner. Otherwise, the main focus is going to be on protein and veggies.
Right.
Protein
the
and
non-starchy ones there.
Yes, the non-starchy ones. Exactly.
And then a little bit of fat, right?
Yes.
You
Oh,
wanna
yeah.
mix a little bit of healthy fat. I know you know this, but yeah.
Yes. The way I describe fat to my patients is you want to think of it as an accessory to your meal.
Yes.
So with each meal, yes, you want to put a little bit of fat. So lunch, for example, you've got your veggies, your meat, your starch, and then you're putting olive oil or a dressing or avocado or cheese, right? Something like that. That's your healthy fat in there. Yeah.
That's perfect. That's great. And then for people who want like a little something sweet, of course, this is where I would say still that concept of food combining where you eat your meal and now instead of having that little, I love dark chocolate as a good option for patients. When you start eating like this, sugar cravings go way down, way down. Plus you're eating all these vegetables and you're getting lots of bitters, which helps with blood sugar control, but also that taste for sweet. And then when you're having it after a meal, so if you're having a couple of squares of like a really, dark chocolate, it's not going to, even if it has some actual sugar added to it, like you can get, it doesn't have to be sugar free. It's not going to raise your blood sugar like it would if you just have it on its own.
Yep.
Yeah.
You got it.
Yeah.
Love it. And then we've only got a minute or two left here.
Maybe what do we want to talk about? Exercise, I think we have to talk about. We mentioned it briefly at the top, but we should really talk about the science around like walking after meals as well here. Because obviously, yes, like we're always pounding this. You need to be moving, like you've got to be doing movement. But this timing with meals is kind of interesting, right?
It's huge. We have awesome data that shows that walking for 10 to 15 minutes after meals can significantly lower blood sugar.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Right. I've had patients in the winter like walk around your house, like just like
go up and down the stairs.
There's just too cold or icy out. Just 10 minutes we're talking about. You're going to walk or set a timer and walk around the house.
Yep.
Put some clothes away, move stuff around.
Yes. Yeah. Don't just like eat and then go back and sit at your desk, right? Or like even stand when you're eating, right? Just like do a little bit because it's just activating your muscles ever so slightly. Those muscles then are going to take up that sugar. You're good to go. It's not hanging out in your bloodstream.
Yeah, it's really great. And then, obviously as it's warmer, going out for a walk like right after dinner. Right?
Yes.
It's really nice. Little stroll. Certainly you could go longer than that, but the data was 10 to 15 minutes of walking after meals really significantly reduces those glucose spikes, which we know then that's improving insulin resistance, right? In the long run. So that's great. Oh,
all right.
Good.
Awesome.
I think we got a lot packed into that episode.
We could do 10 episodes on nutrition. We should. You guys want it.
Yeah.
Well, we hope you found that impactful. If you have questions, other thoughts, make sure you comment on our YouTube channel, subscribe, follow us along so you never miss an episode. We really hope that this was helpful for you and you had some great takeaways. If you're struggling with insulin resistance or even prediabetes, diabetes, remember there is so much that you can do from a nutrition and exercise perspective. We are the Natural Doctors, and we hope you join us for our next episode.